What's up guys, welcome back to the Bike City Woodworks channel. My name is Brian and today I want to show you how I made this hardware organization cabinet to centralize the hardware storage in my shop. Before this, screws and bolts lived in every corner of my shop, which drove me nuts. I'm going to make this organization cabinet out of one half sheet of 1/2-inch plywood that I got at my home center, and I'm going to show you how I put it together with box joints with this incredibly simple jig. So stay tuned and let's get started on the project. As with every project, this one starts with breaking down the parts. Before building, I modeled the cabinet in SketchUp to create a cut list and a plan. I'm following these plans to cut the plywood in a certain order, so I can for sure get the entire thing from this half sheet. If you'd like to make one of your own, there's a link in the description where you can download really easy to follow plans. This is a really simple design. A box with 2 shelves, a backer, and 11 drawers. I'm going to divide most of the drawers with an 1/8-inch plywood divider, so essentially I'll have 20 cubbies for my common hardware. After cutting the half sheet into manageable strips, I could cross-cut each strip into individual parts. And here I actually spent some time labeling each part, because they all end up looking very similar. Alright, now that I've made all the base parts for the cabinet and the drawers, it's time to cut the finger joints. But first, I actually need to make a finger joint jig for myself because I don't own one yet. But it's super simple to make, so let's check it out. For the jig, I set the table saw to just lower than the thickness of my organizer parts. Then I cut a slot into a scrap of plywood. The scrap doesn't need to be a specific dimension, but I think it's wise to make it taller than the sled's fence for stability. The third step is to cut a key that is the width of the slot you just cut. I'm just using a single blade, so I'm cutting my key to 1/8 of an inch to match it, but if you're using a dado blade, and I'd really recommend you do use a dado blade, you'd cut your key to the thickness of that slot. You're looking for a perfect friction fit. I used super glue to hold the key in place, making sure it didn't protrude on the back side of the jig. Once the glue was set, I sawed most of the key off and saved that scrap. I'm going to be using it to set up the jig. And speaking of which, I set up the jig by putting the offcut in between the key and the blade, then securing the jig to my table saw sled. Before I started cutting, I marked a T on the top sides of all my pieces. This is a trick I learned from David Picciuto to keep everything in order. As we cut, the T is always going to point toward the pin no matter what side it's on. The first side of the joint is started by sliding the workpiece up to the key and making a cut. Then it's a matter of cutting the rest of the joints on that side, registering the previous cut on the key. For the second board, we have to use the first as a spacer to create the proper joint. I flipped around the board to put the T toward the pin, then registered the first kerf on that key. You can see this prevents the second board from sliding all the way to the pin. With the T of the second board toward the pin, I made the first cut, which will eliminate the space at the top of this board. Then, I can register that cut against the pin and make the second cut. Rinse and repeat for the rest of the kerfs on the second board. Alright, so this is one of those cases where easy is completely relative, because yeah, it's easier to keep your blade in your table saw instead of putting on a dado stack, but this is going to take a long time. So, what do? Well, I could certainly change out my jig for a wider cut and a wider finger, but I'm not sure I want to do that. I don't know. I'm going to think about it. While I tried to figure out what to do with the box joints, I decided to move on to cabinet assembly. I started by cutting dados for the shelves, using my normal blade and taking several passes to create a dado of the right width. Man, now that I think about it, I really did mess up by using my regular blade. A dado would have gone way faster for both the box joints and the dados. In any case, a tip would be to make the cut on both boards every time you move the fence. That way you'll end up cutting identical dados on both sides. With the good fit for the shelves, I started gluing up. I had heard warnings and horror stories about having too many fingers in a box joint, but I have to say this glue up went surprisingly easily. I didn't really notice any issues with the fingers, but maybe that's because it's plywood and doesn't swell much. I don't know. But if you do know, please leave a comment letting me know why. And if you're liking this video, please let me know by hitting that thumbs up. With the cabinet assembled, I couldn't avoid the drawers any longer, and well, I decided to do the lazy thing and keep the box joint set up as it was. I actually whipped through the 88 drawer joints, so it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But in hindsight, and if I did this again, I would definitely use the dado blade. With all the box joints cut, I could reset the table saw to cut the grooves to accept the drawer bottoms. Since this is a shop project, I really don't much care about grooves showing, but I did learn pretty quickly how I can get them to show on the sides of the box instead of the front, which makes the fronts look pretty good. The way I accomplished this was just to flip around the box parts so that the groove of the bottom ran through a curve in the box joint, so it hides it on the front and back. And by now you've probably noticed this project is entirely about repetition, from cutting the parts in the joints, to the grooves, and then gluing up the drawers. I think projects like this are really great skill builders. Anyone knows you need to practice throwing a football to get better at throwing a football, and I think the same goes for woodworking. That's why I love shop projects, it's like a practice game. With a cabinet like this, I get to throw a ball 100 times without any pressure, and thankfully no tackling. Unless my sons find me. But anyway, with the cabinet and the drawers glued, I made a quick drawer pull template for routing 11 identical pulls. I'm going for a sort of rounded half rectangle pull thingy. I'm sure it has a real name, but I don't know it, so we're going to call it half rectangle pull thingy. After marking the pull and drilling 2 1-inch holes to establish the ends, I used a jigsaw to connect the holes on one end, then used the table saw to free the part. Safety note: that middle section can become a projectile if you're not careful, but with the kerf of the jigsaw and a steady hand, I was able to make a safe cut. Then it was on to shaping with a disc sander, a Dremel, and hand tools. Finally, I didn't like how tall I'd made the pull, so one last pass on the table saw shortened the template to my liking. Putting it together with screws and CA glue will ensure it stays put while routing. And speaking of routing, I did just that with a 1/4 inch straight bit. Because the shank was the exact size of the bit, I just used the shank as the template follower, which let me cut all of the pulls the exact size of the template. And while I had the router out, I quickly cut a rabbet for the back panel too. Now I'm gonna be honest, this was a ton of sanding. I spent a long time sanding the cabinet and all 11 drawers. And off camera I attached the 1/8 inch back panel with glue and a couple of brad nails, then I could call this one complete. Oh, and if you notice that inch tall gap in the top row, you're not crazy and that's not supposed to be there. I apparently didn't read my dimensions properly and cut my sides an inch too long, but I didn't notice that until I had the cabinet and drawers fully assembled. But it still works, and now I have some extra space for any hardware that might be taller than the drawer. Thanks for checking out this project. If you want to make one of your own, I've left a link in the description below where you can download a set of plans. If you like this video, please consider leaving a comment letting me know, and hit that thumbs up so YouTube also knows. And if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that red button thing down there to subscribe for more woodworking videos. Anyway, thanks again for watching and see you next time on the Bike City Woodworks channel.